You'll have to give me a moment while I set up the slideshow. Notre présentation sera en anglais, mais il y a une copie des livres en français. Évidemment, on peut prendre les questions et une discussion en français. We'll make sure there's time after for questions. Let me just make sure this works. Here we go.
If it doesn't, we're in big trouble.
Yeah. This is so the audience at home can. Yep, everything's good. All right, here we go. You start.
Hello. I'd like to start with Darlene Weichhold, first of all. Thank you, dear. We're married, by the way, just for people who didn't know that. Darlene was 14 years old when she sat at home waiting for her call from her favorite older brother. They were going to arrange a shopping expedition for the next day, and he never called. And she went to bed that night after watching TV news about a shooting on her brother's street, and she just figured, okay, that's he's stuck there. It would be years before she would find out that he was killed by a Hells Angels serial murderer.
His name was Yves Apache Trudeau. He was Canada's deadliest killer, killing at least 43 people, many more than famous names most of you may have heard of, like Robert Pickton or Clifford Olson. What's also shocking is he was never caught by police or punished in any real way for his crimes.
At a court hearing much later in his life, the judge presiding over it said, you have killed during your life, you have killed more people than the Canadian Army killed during the entire Gulf War.
We know very little about his early life. He was born in 1946 in Montreal, and unlike most stereotypical origin stories, people like Maurice Montboucher, he didn't grow up in poverty, didn't come from a broken family, had no drug or criminal adolescent. What he did have was a passion for blowing things up. And as a young adult, he gets a job at the CIL factory on the South Shore. And CIL specialized in making bombs and explosives for the Army and the police, a talent that would come very useful for him in later years.
In 1968, he was 22 when he joined the Popeyes, one of the most violent of a whole bunch of motorcycle gangs that were proliferating throughout the province, throughout the province at the time for some unknown reason.
And he loved doing wheelies. I ride a motorcycle, although she made me sell my motorcycle, but
I didn't, but. You saw the error of your ways.
But wheelies, of course, are when you spin the bike and you ride on the back wheel. Now, there's always been a rumor that he got the name Apache because he may have scalped one of his early victims. But like many stories, that's not true. As you can see from this photo of a very young and frankly handsome Trudeau, he has the name Apache when he's still a Popeye before he has really committed his first kill. Whoop.
What happened to the slide?
There we go.
Okay. In November 1969, he had his first encounter with police, and it didn't involve handcuffs or arrests or jail cells. Instead, it was a meeting that had been engineered by the Montreal police chief at the time, who wanted to show the public, which was scared of the bikers, that they were really just regular nice guys. And he said, there are good things you can do with baseball bats and not so good things.
If you had been at the Botanical Gardens in 1969, you could have participated in this wonderful gala with the police and the bikers chumming it up. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. Now, Apache's Trudeau's first kill occurs in 1970. He's working for the Popeyes, and it's actually an accident. There's a young punk who steals a motorbike. They want to exact revenge. He goes out to meet him, and more or less accidentally, it gets violent, and he kills him. And that would be the start of a long reign of violence. Because what happens in 1977 is the Hells Angels. I've written a couple of books on the Hells Angels. 1977, Sonny Barger and the California Angels want to expand worldwide. They want to come to Canada. I'll give you one guess what city they decide to choose. You guessed it. Montreal. And what gang do they want to adopt? The Popeyes, because the Popeyes are the most violent, vicious gang. And Yves Trudeau, who's a member of the Popeyes, will thus become a founding member of the Hells Angels in Canada. And the Hells Angels will grow as they are today, with more than 30 chapters across the country, 500 members, the biggest outlaw motorcycle gang in the country. Whoop, I keep doing that, sorry.
One of his earliest murders was supposed to be of a leader of the rival outlaw gang, and he staked this guy's house in Greenfield Park, and a man pulled up in his car, got out. Trudeau yelled, "Are you Roxy?" Didn't give the guy time to answer, and just pumped him full of bullets. It turned out that this guy was Darlene's brother, and he was renting the house from the guy that Trudeau was supposed to kill.
And what's amazing is the next day, because of newspaper accounts, when Trudeau realizes he killed the wrong guy, he just laughed about it and said, well, somebody who looked like my target deserves to die anyways. He would go on to kill many people, and not just criminals, but also girlfriends, wives, mothers, anybody who got in the way. In 1980, he's going after André Desjardins, a disgraced biker, shows up at his house in the Plateau area. His mother is there, Jean Desjardins. He beats her to a pulp and crams her body in the stairway.
He would go on to kill 43 people that he admitted to, and there may have been more, for all we know. And he would use bullets, he used rope, he used his boots, he used knives. He just was very creative when it came to killing. And drugs fueled the killing spree. At first, he did it because he wanted to be liked and accepted, but then he became addicted to cocaine, and that really spurred the descent into killing for profit.
As he said, to kill was a necessity. It was, if you're in the Hells Angels, you've got to be good at drug trafficking or extortion or prostitution. His specialty, which he just fell into, was murder. But as Lisa explained, his cocaine addiction then fueled both his frenetic activity and his ability to kill, but also he needed the money. Now, he was so good at what he did, the Hells Angels contracted him out, hired him out to rival gangs, including the Dubois gang, and a gang that many of you know if you saw my documentary, Kings of Coke, on Crave. Lisa was in it because she was the only journalist to have ever interviewed one of the West End gang leaders. And at one point, Dooney Ryan, the head of the West End gang, which operated here right around the Atwater neighborhood, down in St. Henry, the Point, they hired Yves Trudeau to take revenge on a man named Patrick McGurnahan who wasn't paying his debts. Here's an excerpt from Kings of Coke. Now, Dooney Ryan gets killed by a rival gang member. So the new leader of the West End gang, Alan the Weasel Ross, hires Trudeau again to take revenge against Dooney's killers, a man named Paul April. and 3 of his associates. Now, if any of you were in this building in the last weekend of November 1985, a Saturday night, the Canadians were playing at the Forum. It was going to be Guy Lafleur's last game, although nobody knew it at the time. The crowds file out, but at 4 a.m. that morning, there's suddenly a huge shattering explosion. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong button. Now, that was just the beginning of the end of Trudeau, because for payment for this kill, he was told by the West End gang, well, you guys owe us a lot of money. So instead of us paying you the rest of the money, go to your other chapters and get the money from them. That's what Trudeau does, but it began to, frankly, piss off, excuse the language, the other bikers. And they were angry that Trudeau and his North chapter were not only mishandling the money, but they were sniffing coke instead of selling it.
They were called the sniffers.
Your turn.
Okay, so Trudeau decided that he would become an informant, inform on his former buddies in the Hells Angels.
But first, it's the massacre.
Oh, right, of course. I'm sorry. I'm
That's
like
okay.
losing the place.
Trudeau knows that the bikers are angry at him. What he doesn't know is there's a secret plot by the Hells Angels to massacre his chapter, including him. They invite the bikers to and here's a picture of his chapter, the Laval chapter, and that's him. Really handsome guys. Like, when you invite these guys over for Easter or Passover, yeah, just wonderful guys.
Yeah.
They invite them to the Lennoxville chapter, which is on the South Shore, and with machine guns, they massacre 5 of them, of their own brethren, their own comrades in arms, dump the bodies in the St. Lawrence River. Trudeau
Escapes.
And how does he escape?
He escapes because he's undergoing drug rehabilitation in Oka, of all things. So he hears wind of what had happened, and he begins to think, oh my God, what am I going to do? He's visited by one of the chief killing bikers attachés, and who says that if you kill 2 other people, you'll be okay.
Trudeau realizes, as he says, I'm as good as dead already. So he's arrested on a minor gun offense. Most bikers would have fought the offense and gotten out with very little time, but he pleads guilty and accepts jail because he realizes that jail is probably the safest place for him. But then he hears word of a $50,000 contract on his head. So he calls the SQ, and according to one report, I love this, he says, I have killed for them, and now they want to kill me? That's gratitude? Nothing like an ungrateful killer. Then the police offer him a sweetheart deal. You could read the deal.
Okay. What? Hold on here. Just a second. I got to put my glasses on. Okay, the sweetheart deal was it was life in prison because that is the law in Canada. But what it in fact amounted to was 2 months for every murder that he admitted to committing to, because he ended up spending just 7 years in prison.
And it wasn't just 7 years in prison. It was stakes, a TV, familiar visits, and he would get $40,000 from the get-go and $10,000 after for every year after. Now, the witnesses against the Hells Angels are not going to be choir boys. Lisa covered the biker trials. You need killers and drug dealers and people inside the biker gang to testify against them. But you have to make sure they're going to deliver the goods. They gave Trudeau this deal expecting that he'd be a great witness, but Lisa will explain what happened.
Just remember that they never backed up. The police never backed up what Trudeau was telling them. They thought that they had this great resource. And in 5 court appearances between 1986 and 1988, he was a bust. He was one of the worst witnesses to ever appear on the stand. Every biker he testified against walked away unscathed. One of them, after the jury deliberated for, I think it was an hour and a half, and one of the hours was for the jury to have a last lunch together.
The Americans were always much smarter. The Americans, when they signed deals with snitches, made any deal, like time off for 7 years, contingent on how well they testified. And if you didn't testify well, much less tell the truth, you wouldn't get the deal. There's a wonderful scene in the book where one of the lead American prosecutors, who is investigating the West End gang. One of the reasons I started investigating the West End gang back in the 90s, and as you can see from my books and the documentary Kings of Coke, that led to a Mountie, a top Mountie, the head of the drug squad in Montreal, committing suicide the day before we broadcast our report, because we were investigating the power of the bikers and the West End gang and their corruption. An American prosecutor has in custody Alan the Weasel Ross. Remember the man who had hired Trudeau? He was never arrested in Canada, nor were any of the other West End gang leaders, but Alan Ross is arrested by the Americans. The Americans now put him on trial. He calls up one of the Montreal cops who says, "Could you get Yves Trudeau down here for the trial?" The cop obligingly, as we describe in the book, calls up the SQ. Trudeau's now safely in jail. He's finished all his trials. And the SQ say, well, it might not be good for his mental stability and his rehabilitation. So the Montreal cop, somewhat sheepishly, goes back to Florida and tells Dave McGee, the prosecutor, you know, I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. But don't worry, this guy was a horrible witness. Like, he would have been a disaster. He's just a bad witness. And the American prosecutor says, no, you misunderstood me. I don't want him as a witness. I want him as an exhibit, right? I wanted to bring him in and say, this is what the West End gang hired, this serial assassin who confessed to 43 people. He didn't need him. Alan Ross was sentenced to life and died in an American prison. Now, what would happen to Yves Trudeau?
The biker wars raged on for 4 years. Daniel Desrochers was killed. The Rockers and the Hells Angels were going at it. And Trudeau watched for a while from his prison cell in Parthenay, with his steaks and his color TV and with his conjugal visits and whatever else.
And you can make the argument, I think, and we didn't see this at the beginning, but one of the reasons when people said, why did you do a book on Yves Apache Trudeau, who's not a likable character? Because it's the origin story. We all lived through the biker wars in the 90s. We all know Maurice Montboucher, 160 people killed in the streets. Maurice Boucher will be acquitted in his first trial. When I was doing my first documentary, as Montboucher storms out of the courthouse a free man, he pushes through the doors and he knocks over the journalists, including Lisa. So you see Lisa going down. So in the edit suite, I would keep replaying that video of Lisa being knocked down by Montboucher.
But he was arrogant. You saw his arrogance. And he was arrogant because of what Trudeau had taught the bikers they could be.
That you could get away with committing 40 murders. The police weren't looking at you. They saw it as just another gangland slaying. And that's what the bikers were able to do until the police got serious, set up special biker squads, and then went after Montboucher and the rest of the Hells Angels. Meanwhile, though, Trudeau is in jail, and then Lisa will pick up the story. He will get parole.
Yes, he was paroled. We don't know where he was paroled from, if it was from outside of the province or not, but he ended up back here under the protection of the Sûreté Québec, and he was living in Valleyfield, driving a transport bus and helping seniors at a seniors living residence. Yeah, it really makes you feel confident, doesn't it? Um, but then he was laid off.
And he is he's arrested in 2004. Remember, he's being paid by the police. He's got an assumed identity. He's being protected by the police. He's arrested in 2004 for sexually assaulting a child. He's brought back to prison and on trial. That's where Judge Michel Duceppe says those famous lines. It must be noted that during your life you have killed more people than the Canadian Army did during the Gulf War. And then he says, definitely there is embedded in you an instinct that is evil. He goes back in prison, and Lisa will pick up what happens to him when he applies for parole again in 2008.
It was he had cancer. He was dying of cancer, and he wanted to be paroled on compassionate grounds, which is something he never showed to any of the people he killed. And Darlene, remember Darlene, the 14-year-old whose life was destroyed, really, by the murder of her brother, had never seen Trudeau before, never done anything. She went to the parole hearing. And it was a parole hearing where the commissioners asked Trudeau, "What do you think about death?" And he said, "I see it as a punishment." And he also said that he wanted to show his mother that he was a good person, despite all that he had done in the past. You can imagine how Darlene felt about this.
Now, do you think she saw it as a punishment? Because imagine, she's sitting, it's now 2008, Billy was killed in
1978.
1978, so it's, you know, it's decades later. She's sitting, seeing this shell of a man, right? By now he was in a wheelchair, crumpled up, dying of cancer. But do you think she agreed with the parole decision? Did she see a form of justice one way or the other?
I think she may have, in the end, seen it as a form of justice because he was dying, and that was final. But she didn't want to see him be released from prison at all.
And in the end, of course, the irony is he's never punished by the justice system. He's punished by cancer. And he dies a few months after. He dies the same way he lived, in anonymity. Nobody knows exactly when he died, where his body is buried. But as you know, by following the news, you've seen some hits against the alleged mafia leader out on in the Laval area. In November 2023, Greg Woolley, one of the rare black associates of the Hells Angels, a key friend of Maurice Boucher and Mafia, Vito Rizzuto, the mafia leader, was gunned down in a parking lot as he's walking with his little infant son and his wife. A classic sniper shot from a distance, just like Yves Trudeau would have done. And so, of course, the point is that there are other Yves Trudeaus out there right now. There are other hitmen out there right now. Mm-hmm. The Statistics Canada estimates that 20% of homicides, most homicides are familial, domestic violence, people who know each other, but 20% of homicides come from gang violence. So there's another hitman out there. We're glad to say that our book is doing well. You can give the stats.
We're number 5 on the Toronto Star's bestseller list.
Just 4 behind Mr. Carney.
Yes.
You can also find out, we're around, we'll take questions, and we're around in the back to talk to you. You can talk about your website.
You can find me at lisafitterman.com, and you can read some of the articles that I've written. One profile of France Charbonneau, the judge, former prosecutor, who I think is one of the best and most dogged in Canada. And the story I did on the corruption scandal, where she presided over the hearings.
And on my website, you can find out much more about the book. You could listen to interviews we did on CJAD and on CBC. This presentation is being recorded on YouTube, so we'll put it up on YouTube that you could share with your friends. There's also on my website information about my other biker books, and those of you who might know the Stephen Truscott case, Canada's most famous wrongful conviction. I wrote a book about that, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the hitman who killed Lincoln but came to Montreal before and boasted about his plans to do away with the president. So I think we have plenty of time for questions. For the Zoom audience, if you have questions, Lynn will come around and give you a mic so the Zoom audience can hear you. Perfect.